And welcome back to the show. The New York Immigration Coalition is an umbrella policy and advocacy organization that represents over 200 immigrant and refugee rights groups throughout New York City. Now, the NYIC not only establishes a forum for immigrant groups to voice their concerns, but also provides a platform for collective action to drive positive social change. The NYIC was established in 1987 to address the impact of the 1986 law that actually allowed undocumented immigrants to adjust their status. And more than 30 years later, the nation is still debating the issue of immigration. Joining us now to share a little bit more about this topic, talk about immigration and the work that's going on, we're pleased to be joined by the Interim Vice President of Advocacy at the New York Immigration Coalition, Alana Pilar Cantillo, and we welcome you to the show, Alana.
Thank you so much for having me. Happy to be here with you.
I'm glad to have you. I first want to get your take. We know that in recent times we've seen the latest in racism and also hatred and bigotry against the Asian American community. With your work with immigrants, talk to us about just your reaction to what we're seeing with regards to the Asian hate that has been further increased over recent times.
Yeah, no, we're really disheartened and disgusted by the way that our Asian American friends, colleagues, allies, neighbors have been unjustly targeted in recent months. We know that a lot of this vitriol, came first and foremost at the hands of our former president. We know that hate has been on the rise for a number of years. And that we really need to be investing in local organizations that work with these communities that can respond to the trauma of these cases, that can provide the benefits and access to the services that they need when they become victimized in such a way. We've really been, following the lead of our Asian American leaders and our Asian led organizations at the NYIC to tell us how to best support them, to uplift the voices of the victims, to talk about the horrible impact that it has, the horrible chilling effect that it has on entire communities who feel like their own, leaders and their own neighbors aren't standing by them, and that they aren't accountable to the horrible disease that everyone has been impacted by. Immigrants have been disproportionately impacted, Asian among those, and so we're really disheartened to see the way that they're getting lashed out and they're being victimized. It's sort of like being double victimized, first by the pandemic and the lack of access to so many resources, and then by folks turning their back and really placing the blame on them.
Yeah. And as we look right now, we look and we see not only the issue of Asian Americans and Asians, I should say, receiving hate all across the United States. The issue of immigration is really at the forefront again. It continues to be of huge debate. Give us your take on the recent things that you see with regards to immigration in New York. From your perspective, are things getting better?
Slightly better in recent months, I will say. We're seeing incremental change at the federal level, and that's where that's been a significant campaign of the NYIC since the start of the pandemic, when we saw economic relief and stimulus reaching some members of our community, but not all. Specifically, there was an exclusion of ITIN filers and certain undocumented folks from the stimulus relief. And this virus has not discriminated the economic impact that it's taken, the public health impact that it's taken. And so we don't think that something like status should be a barrier, for having our immigrant brothers and sisters being able to re-engage in our economy and get support when we're all struggling through this hard time. And so, you referenced some of the change that we've seen. We've seen a little bit of access going to some of our immigrant families. So for instance, in the most recent stimulus, citizen children of undocumented workers were able to get some cash benefits. Back in December, folks that were filing jointly, ITIN filers, and folks that were married to folks with that were citizens who had previously not been able to have access to any of the economic relief were included. And so it's very, very incremental change. We're going to fight to do a lot more. We need the enforcement that's happening at the border to be, rightly wronged and to be addressed in a way that's humane, that doesn't put our folks in detention after all of the suffering that we've seen in our communities. And we also need to make sure that the recovery that's being disseminated to our communities actually have access from some undocumented families.
And when we look at what's going on right now as far as the immigrant population, a lot of concern continues to go with deportations, ICE involvement. Are we seeing a decrease in regards to ICE-related matters?
Fortunately, here in New York, we have seen decreases over the pandemic. And I think it's just, like we saw a lot of other sort of courthouses shut down and services and other sort of enforcement happening as people were staying home. And so while we were seeing a decrease in deportations, we're also seeing an opportunity for more folks to actually access citizenship. And in order for us to be able to address those court reopenings and those increase in applications like we've seen with DACA and with TPS, we need folks to be able to have access to legal representation. And so the NYIC last year introduced the first in the nation bill that would help low-income New Yorkers that are facing detention have access to a lawyer, because as you can imagine, these cases are very complicated, and you have a 10 times higher likelihood of being able to settle your case and secure your residency here in the States if you have a lawyer.
Mm-hmm. This show pretty much highlights a lot of the inequities that people face. We talk about that in the intro, that, part of our job is to talk about the inequities that people face. Give us a broader perspective and a more in-depth perspective when we talk about the immigrant population and the inequities, because they're huge and they're vast.
Absolutely. And I'll just give you one example. During such trying times, during the middle of a public health crisis, we need folks to have access to health insurance. Luckily, as I'm sure you've reported on the show, a lot of these services like testing and even vaccines have been free of cost, but we know that the impact of COVID-19 on folks' health and physical well-being has been significant. And so we have a bill before the state legislature right now that would give access to what is called here in New York, the Essential Plan. It's healthcare for low-income folks. And we would want to expand that program so that it covers undocumented people who have tested positive for COVID. Because what we're seeing is that, these long haulers, as they're called, they don't have access to the treatment maybe from the high blood pressure that they developed from the long-standing pulmonary effects that they were having from COVID, from asthma, from sort of all of these other all these other symptoms and illnesses that have been triggered by the virus, and that they still need to manage long after the virus is gone. And so that campaign is called Coverage for All. To fund it, we are asking for $20 million in the upcoming state's budget. 20 million in the grand scheme of the budget is a drop in the bucket. And really, we're looking at the folks who are the most at risk, who have been severely impacted by COVID-19 and who, after they do receive access to free testing, have no way to manage the long-term risk of the disease.
Mm. Also, I know that you have the Defend Our New York collaborative. Give us a little bit about that.
Yes. So as you mentioned, though, we've been seeing less enforcement around ICE and CBP and less, border enforcement. We anticipate that it's going to pick up as folks start reopening, as folks start getting vaccinated, and people feel more comfortable to move around the state. So the New York for All Act is one of our top priorities under the banner of Defend and Protect All New Yorkers. And what that bill would do is it wouldn't allow for law enforcement, correction officers, probation officers, and staff of those agencies to coordinate with ICE. And so what we found is that when folks enter our state's criminal justice system, they are at a secondary risk with ICE when state employees are giving out the information, are doing collusion efforts with ICE, and ultimately doing the federal government's dirty work. That's not what New Yorkers pay taxes for. Those are not the actions that reflect our values. And unfortunately, here in New York State, we have a two-tiered system. You know, if you're lucky enough to live in a municipality with some sanctuary policy, with some lack of agreements that happen between local law enforcement and federal immigration enforcement, greater risk. You're at greater risk of going in to file for a marriage certificate, going in to get a driver's license, and then have maybe an anti-immigrant, a racist employee use maybe that you're using foreign documents against you. And so we want to end that collusion. We want to end that collaboration that we're seeing and have seen in for a number of years, so that folks can work, go to school, go to housing court, be able to access a lot of the key services that they invest in through their local taxes and their retail taxes, so that they can really be, protected, and so that New York employees are not colluding and doing the federal government's dirty work.
Yeah. Well, let's talk about the federal government for a minute. Obviously, a new presidential administration. Jury's still out. Got just a couple of months under the belt. But so far, do you like what you're seeing?
We at the NYIC, we're really appreciative of the U.S. Citizenship Act. Seeing such a strong piece of legislation that provides a pathway to citizenship for 11 million over several years. It's not something that's going to really change folks' livelihood overnight, but it's a step in the right direction. We are supportive of the bill, but we also understand that there are some limitations to the way that the federal government operates. We know that there is a filibuster that doesn't allow policies to be enacted without a supermajority of 60 votes, of which the current the Democrats and the majority caucus don't have. We're grateful for the leadership of the Vice President Harris to go in and be the tie-breaking vote. But we know that it's going to be a long fight. The executive orders that we've seen from the Biden administration have been heartening. The removal of the African and Muslim ban, the removal of challenges in the courts, like public charge and like increasing citizenship applications and fee waivers, all these things that really help out our most vulnerable. But we see some other opportunities. We're discussing right now a campaign around reconciliation. So reconciliation is a budget maneuver where folks only need a simple majority, and we're trying to get 5 million folks here in the U.S. to get a pathway to citizenship through this process. And reconciliation, we're specifically targeting DACA and TPS holders, as well as essential workers. It's really unjust to rely on the work of immigrants, on the skill set of immigrants to get folks out of this, COVID pandemic and through a recovery that will benefit everyone, and then not give those people permanent protections to stay in the country that they're making such wonderful and necessary investments in during our time of need.
Yeah. A lot of conversation was had about the African Muslim ban that was affecting people's travel. And even though we're not still at the place where we're fully mobile yet, how big of a game changer was that for the people that you serve?
It was, like I said, it was a commitment that we had received on the presidential campaign trail. It was something that was a day one demand on our behalf. And luckily by the 3rd year anniversary, it had been off the books. Executive orders only follow the administrator that is under them. So, the governor or the president. So we want something more permanent. There's a bill introduced called the No Muslim Ban Act. And so we want to prevent any sort of future politician from being able to have such significant pain, disruption, separation to our families that are entirely politically motivated by an anti-Muslim administration.
Mm-hmm. Workers' rights are huge. I mean, you've got a lot of immigrants who are working in the fields. We know that there's inequities there. Do we see things improving for those who have boots on the ground and really are doing the work when it comes to pay, when it comes to equity?
Yeah, so they're doing the work, as you mentioned. They have been essential workers. They can't stay home. The New York State Comptroller just released a great report that shows that the transportation hubs in predominantly immigrant communities have maintained the status quo. The usage is the same. Folks are going to work. Folks are figuring out, how to keep a roof over their heads and food on the table. And so the workers have really made the most significant sacrifice, and we have to make sure that they're supported. And so, as mentioned earlier, federal relief has not gotten in their hands. And so we're pushing significantly for a campaign called the Fund for Excluded Workers. The Fund for Excluded Workers would create parity between the robust unemployment investment that we saw last year, of unemployment, as stores shuttered, as hotels, were closing, and a lot of, facilities no longer needed some of the immigrant labor, like the deliveries and the cleaners and folks of that nature. Unfortunately, if you didn't have status, and we think the number is around 500,000 New Yorkers, you didn't qualify for unemployment and you weren't able to access those funds. And I'm sure you have heard about how important those extra $600 a week were, and how important the extended weeks, right? It wasn't the standard unemployment program. The federal government stepped in to say, we know that that folks are going to be struggling for a long time. And so that's why they created such robust unemployment protections. Undocumented workers, didn't have access to those funds. And so the Fund for Excluded Workers asking for $3.5 billion in New York's budget to meet the moment and to undo that unjust policy that came out of our federal government and the way that our immigrant and undocumented families were left out. So that would give them access to a state fund that would give them retroactive pay for the weeks that they were also unemployed, and sort of the significant reduction in their hours that they saw, and give them some relief for housing, for healthcare services, for transportation. As I mentioned, these folks were still going in and buying their monthly Metro cards so that they could get to the grocery stores and the pharmacies and the medical facilities and the home, give access to the home healthcare services. And so we want to make sure that they get that. And so we're fighting really hard for $3.5 billion for a fund for excluded workers in our New York State budget.
Yeah. Before we go, I want to have the opportunity for our viewers to have an opportunity to connect with you, maybe be a part of some of the policy and the advocacy that's going on. How do they do that?
Yes, they can visit NYIC.org. They can follow us on many of our social media channels at the NYIC. We take a lot of actions, and we really rely on the solidarity of New Yorkers, on the allyship of New Yorkers to stand up for us when we're marching in the streets, when we're protesting, when we're hosting die-ins, to show the strength in numbers, to show that even though I might have received the stimulus, even though I might not have been directly impacted or suffered from COVID, that many of our immigrant brothers and sisters are, and we need to make sure that they have access to the benefits that they have and will continue to invest in with their taxes and with their contributions to our workforce, and with their contributions to our society at large.
Alana, we're going to leave it there, but thank you so much for joining us here on the Social Justice Forum. Glad to have you with us.
Glad to be here.